So far in these videos about gospel identity, we've talked about what is the gospel. We've talked about the gospel and change. And in this video, I want to talk to you about the gospel and ups and downs, the highs and lows in our lives. If you're in any level of leadership, you're going to have some highs and you're going to have some lows. It's inevitable. I've heard it said, if you want to make people happy, sell ice cream, don't be a leader. And I've learned that to be true. In fact, if you're leading and everybody's happy, you're probably not actually leading. And so there's going to be ups and downs, highs and lows. And how does the gospel and our identity resting in the gospel, how does it help us in those inevitable moments? Pastor Tim Keller says that when work is our identity, when anything other than Jesus, anything other than the good news about Jesus, the gospel, becomes our identity, then here's what happens. Success goes to our head and failure goes to our heart, or suffering goes to our heart. If your identity is in being a leader or a preacher or a pastor, then when you succeed, you're in great danger. And the danger is pride and arrogance, becoming unteachable, unapproachable, unbearable. You begin to believe your own press and you begin to build your identity around the things that you do well and the gift instead of the gift giver. That's what success will do to us if our identity is found in anything other than Jesus. But failure and suffering has a different effect. It actually goes right to our hearts. And it destabilizes our belief. It disorients our lives. It can tear down the things that we've believed to be true for so long. And it can actually cause us to question God's plan and purposes and our part in that. And so in this video, I want to talk to you about the two dangers that Keller lays out for us in his quote, the danger of success and the danger of suffering or failure. Both of these are real dangers, and the gospel, and specifically gospel identity, helps us navigate these two dangers. The danger of success, first, as I said, is that it goes to your head. And that once you succeed, you become a slave to more success. That it's never enough, right? If you talk to the wealthiest people in the world about how much money is enough, most of them will say, well, just $1 more. And they're driven. They get up every morning into pursuit of one more dollar, even though they have more money in their bank account than they could ever possibly spend in many lifetimes. Because there becomes a enslavement, a slavery to more. We're not created to be satisfied with natural success. You're not created to be satisfied in your heart by being a good preacher. You got to be a great preacher. And then you don't just have to be a great preacher, you have to be a better preacher than the guy down the street. Because as C.S. Lewis says, pride finds no pleasure in having something. Pride only finds pleasure in having more of something than the person next to you. And so success, the danger of success in leadership and finding our identity in our success is that we begin to actually find our idols being handed to us. So our idols of power, approval, comfort, control, acceptance, whatever they are, success will often bring those idols right to you and put them in front of you. And now the things that you really love most or that you're tempted to love most, all of a sudden they're readily accessible because you are succeeding. And it's such a dangerous place to be because, as we talked about in the last video, all of a sudden Jesus is not what you treasure or who you treasure most. Jesus is not beautiful to your heart. He's useful to your heart. And what you really fall in love with is success. I think we have to be so careful, especially in this time in history, when we have so much access to other churches and ministries, and we can follow them on social media, and we can see how they are succeeding and how they might be growing, and the new buildings that they are building, the property, the facilities, the campaigns. It can really seem like everybody else is succeeding and winning, and then we're really becoming enslaved to trying to do the same. And when we finally do, instead of celebrating it in a healthy way and worshiping and thanking God for the work that He's doing, we begin to credit ourselves and we begin to fill our hearts up with these things. There's a real danger with success. One of the dangers with success in all areas of leadership is that we actually fall in love with solutions more than problems. Successful leaders create successful solutions. Solutions can be things like personnel, processes, strategies, policies, systems, programs, right? So as leaders, we're always trying to address problems by creating solutions. Now here's the danger. When you create a solution that is wildly successful, you fall in love with that solution. And when you fall in love with a solution, you might hold on to it too long. You might all of a sudden consider it to be sacred, untouchable. You fall in love with the method more than the message. And you have to understand that solutions are wonderful, but they're not timeless. And so if we succeed with our solutions, sometimes we hold on to our solutions so long that they actually become the problem. There's this remarkable story in the Old Testament. I won't remember all the different passages in which this story is found, but one is found, I believe, in Exodus, where the people of Israel are going through the wilderness and they begin to complain. And in their complaining, God sends these fiery serpents that begin to bite them or something, and they're getting sick and they're dying. And God tells Moses and Aaron to construct this bronze serpent. And they said, make this bronze serpent and then lift it up on a pole or on a stick. And as people look at it, they would be healed and they would live. This whole idea of look and live. So this bronze serpent became a tool of deliverance and freedom for one generation. Well, years later, there was a king in the Old Testament. I think maybe it was Hezekiah. And he had to actually destroy the bronze serpent. And the reason he had to destroy it is because future generations were worshiping the bronze serpent. They loved the solution that God had provided for previous generations. So here's what I want you to see. God raised up a leader in one generation to provide a solution that became a tool of freedom and deliverance for his people. But he had to raise up a leader in another generation to actually tear a previous solution down because it had become a source of bondage. There are some things that we might be doing in our churches that were solutions that worked 15, 20, 50 years ago, and we've fallen in love with them. If we succeeded with them 20 years ago, thank God for that. But what got us here will not necessarily get us there, and that's one of the dangers of success. In 2 Corinthians 12, 8 through 10, we see Paul struggling with this thing called the thorn in the flesh. We don't know for sure what exactly this, most likely some sort of physical ailment. Some people think some sort of eye condition, but we don't know for sure. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 8 through 10, it says that 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. Paul is asking God, take this from me. But God says to Paul, my grace is sufficient for you, and my power is made perfect in weakness. And what's Paul's response? I would have been like, oh, that's a bummer of an answer. But Paul said, therefore, I will boast all the more gladly in my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, he says, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. This is so counterintuitive to everything that we see in our world, in our culture, in our society, and even sometimes what we hear in Christian leadership circles. We think, well, God is closest to me when I am at my best and when I am strongest and my ministry is succeeding and everybody is happy with what I'm doing. But Paul learns a really important lesson that you and I need to also learn, that God is actually nearest to us in our weaknesses, that he delights to show up and show off in our weaknesses, because then he receives all the glory. When I am weak, then I am strong. The danger of success. Secondly, the danger of suffering. Keller says that success goes to your head, but failure or suffering goes to your heart. And when we suffer, it's so easy to lose our way, especially if we're not resting in the gospel. See, the gospel says that God owes us nothing, but he gave us everything. And sometimes when we suffer, we forget both sides of that equation. We begin to think, no, God actually owes me some things. And I remember struggling with this in my own season of losing my father and losing my brother and going through some personal loss and struggle and kind of wondering, God, I'm serving you, I'm doing what I can to advance your kingdom, and yet these things are happening and they seem like they maybe could have been avoided. You could have stepped in and you could have done something. Don't you at least owe me that? And I began to forget the first half of the gospel, which is God doesn't owe me anything. Because of my sin against God, because of my sin nature, God would have been just before the cross to condemn me to life apart from him. But because of the cross and Jesus' work on my behalf, he's now just and faithful to forgive my sins when I confess them. God owes me nothing, but on the other hand, he gave me everything. And if everything is grace and everything is from God, then there's nothing he can't ask of me. There's nothing that he can't take from me. And I'm not saying that lightly because, like you, I've lost things in my life that I wish I hadn't lost. And yet the gospel has a powerful way of centering us in those seasons of suffering and in those seasons of loss. So the danger of success is that it goes to our head. The danger of failure and suffering is that it goes to our heart. It makes us angry. It makes us embittered. It makes us question truths that we've always believed about God. It pushes us into isolation and separates us from other people. Now, what do we do when we suffer? And I want to give you 3 things that have helped me before I finish this video. We look back, we look in, we look forward. So what I mean is when we look back to the cross. And we see a God who suffered. Christianity is the only faith that at the center of its faith is the humiliation of its own God. We see God the Father sending his Son to suffer on our behalf. Jesus suffering unthinkable physical, emotional, and spiritual anguish upon the cross for us in our place. So whatever we are going through, whatever we are suffering, when we wonder why, if we'll look back at the cross, we'll know that the one answer that it cannot be is that God does not love us and that God does not understand where we're at. So we look back at the cross. Secondly, we have to look in. And by looking in, I mean we have to realize that it's in struggle and it's in failure and it's in suffering that the deepest work is done inside of us. Most of you, if you look back at the seasons of your life where you grew the most, they were not comfortable seasons. We don't grow when we're comfortable. We don't grow when things are great. We grow when there's struggle. And so we need to look in and realize, God, there is something you're doing in me. And I may not see it, I may not know it, but with time, I think that we do look back and we see the growth that God was working all things together for the good of those who love him and trust him and are called to his purposes and plans. So we look back at the cross and remind ourselves of the love of God. We look in, trusting that he's doing a good work in us, but then also we look forward. We look forward to heaven. Paul in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 is giving the people this hope of Jesus' return in heaven. In 1 Thessalonians 4:18, after he talks about the return of Jesus, he says this, "Therefore, encourage one another with these words." Historically, the church has actually not used those words to encourage each other. We used them to argue with each other about Jesus' return. We've used them to scare other people into making a decision for Jesus. Paul says when you think about heaven and Jesus' eventual return to take us home, it should encourage our hearts. When I think about heaven, there's three things I read in a book by Randy Alcorn that have always stuck with me. Three things that will be true about you and me in heaven that help me when I'm suffering. Number one, in heaven, you and I will love and serve God the way we wish we always had. Just let that sit with you for a second. How do you wish you served God? How do you wish you loved God? In heaven, you will, and you always will. Secondly, in heaven, we will be healed of all of our wounds. And there's wounds that we're all aware of, but there's wounds we're not aware of. And the healing that is going to come from Jesus when we're with him will wipe away all of that pain. Can you imagine yourself without pain, without sorrow, without regret, without shame, without sin, without struggle? That will be you as you're healed in the presence of Jesus for all eternity. And then lastly, in heaven, we will be led into ever-increasing joy. Nothing in this world gets better. You know, the first time you eat a great steak, that's the best it's ever going to get. The first bite of food, that's the best it's ever going to get. The first time I saw a movie in a big theater, that's the most awe it ever evoked out of me. Everything in this world, the Bible uses this phrase, the glory fades. It doesn't get better. But in heaven, somehow, every day is going to be better than the one before. And we're going to be led into ever-increasing joy. Let me finish this video with this paragraph from C.S. Lewis's book, The Last Battle, which was the last book he wrote in the Chronicles of Narnia. He's talking about the end of time. He's talking about us being in heaven. And he says, as Aslan, this lion that represents Christ, as he spoke, he no longer looked to them like a lion. But the things that began to happen after that were so great and beautiful that I cannot write them. And for us, this was the end of all the stories. And we can most truly say that they all lived happily ever after. But for them, it was only the beginning of the real story. All their life in this world and all their adventures in Narnia had only been the cover and the title page. Now at last they were beginning chapter 1 of the great story which no one on earth has read, which goes on forever, in which every chapter is better than the one before. When we're suffering, when we're walking through a season of failure, look back at the cross, look in and trust in what the Spirit is doing in your life, and look forward to the hope of heaven, that it won't always be this way. Someday we will be with Christ. Jesus will be with us. We will fully be his people, and in seeing him and beholding him, we will be changed into his image.